Next up, we have Wendy Lennon. So Wendy Lennon was previously an English teacher for a decade. Inspired by her mother's Windrush migration, her academic work, her mixed-race heritage, and childhood on the English coast, Wendy is developing a narrative nonfiction work exploring Shakespeare, race, and the sea. She is a doctoral researcher at the Shakespeare Institute, working across history, literature, and race. Her first academic book, Shakespeare, Race, and Pedagogy, Early Modern Colonialism to the Windrush, is due to be published this year. So please can we have a round of applause and welcome Wendy Lennon to the stage.
12 women decide to travel to another country in pursuit of a new beauty treatment. Several men keep writing comments that these particular 12 women, and women like them, are ugly. They are desperate to transform their looks. This sounds like a choice made by modern women in pursuit of beauty treatments in our social media society, doesn't it? It's not. It's the synopsis of a story written by Ben Jonson in 1605. In this play called The Mask of Blackness, 12 black women travel with their father from Africa to undergo a beauty treatment which transforms their skin from black to white. Their mask of blackness is removed. Ben Jonson, who is Shakespeare's contemporary pictured here, gives us detailed stage directions for the performance which took place on Twelfth Night, 1605 at Whitehall, which is just a 12-minute drive from where we are. It was performed by white actors who covered themselves in makeup to make them appear in the form of an Ethiop. The female characters, played by James I's wife, Queen Anne, and her ladies, were described by an audience member, Dudley Carlton, as follows. Their apparel was rich, but too light and courtesan-like for such great ones. Instead of vizards, their faces and arms up to their elbows were painted black, which was disguise sufficient, for they were hard to be known. But it became them nothing so well as their red and white, and you cannot imagine a more ugly sight than a troop of lean-cheeked Moors. Negative attitudes towards blackness that we see here in Jonson's play and his audience were part of Shakespeare's contemporary literature, social and cultural landscape in which he was creating plays like Othello. It's important to acknowledge that these attitudes to blackness were the precursor to hundreds of years of slavery. Furthermore, this image and adage dates back to classical antiquity, but continue to appear frequently in 16th and 17th century literature, and also emblem books, precisely at a time when the English were encountering African people in Africa, but also in England and in Shakespeare's London. The image and adage to wash an Ethiop white was common. It not only links the appearance that the women in Jonson's play were so desperate to remove, but also connects negatively to the fundamental traits of a person. I was so shocked and deeply saddened by the female character's desire to remove their heritage and discard their black beauty. I was also shocked that I'd studied Ben Jonson's work at university and I'd never heard of this play. It was hidden, and I almost felt like it had been lied to. I'd been lied to because I didn't understand the context. I didn't understand him in fullness as a writer. Studying this play as a doctoral researcher living in our modern world, I was struck by the modern day legacies that we are confronted with. It is my hope that you, the next generation, are proud of who you are, that you don't change yourselves regardless of what adverts or styled poets may say, think, or write. I also hope that we respect, appreciate, and celebrate our differences. Studying race in the early modern period, I always feel a frustration, a kind of tension between frustration but also fascination. In spite of my frustrations and shock with Jonson's play and the offensive language in Shakespeare's Othello, one aspect that I continue to be fascinated by is the migrations that took place. As a child of the Windrush generation, I was intrigued by the possibility that women, just like my mother and my grandmother, would leave their own countries and migrate of their own accord to come to England. I wanted to find out more. Why did people choose to migrate? What were the interactions like between different cultures and nations in the 16th and 17th century? Which cross-cultural encounters took place in Shakespeare's England, and how were these interactions reflected in Shakespeare's play? Hakluyt's Principal Navigations is a collection of first-hand accounts of voyages undertaken in the early modern period, which really helped me to answer some of these questions. And I share my findings in my book and my doctoral research, and that's what I'm going to be sharing with you today. And we're going to be looking at some connections between the context and specific parts of Shakespeare's play. So, quick checkpoint question. So if the answer to these questions are true, then show me one finger or one hand. If it's false, then two fingers or two arms, if you like. So question one, see if you've been listening to what I've said so far. In the play Mask of Blackness, 14 women travelled from Africa to England. One for true, two for false. Show me. Very good. It was 12 women. Well done. So everybody had false. Question two. Ben Jonson wrote The Mask of Blackness in 1605. One for true, two for false. Show me. That is true. Well done. And Hakluyt's Principal Navigations are accounts of voyages undertaken in the 16th century. True or false? Show me. Very good. That's true. Okay, so in Hakluyt's volumes, we learn of John Hawkins, who was an English naval commander, a privateer, and a slave trader. In 1564, the year of Shakespeare's birth, Hawkins persuaded Queen Elizabeth I to support his voyage. He took approximately 400 people from Africa. Some he brought from the Portuguese, some he kidnapped. Hawkins was celebrated and rewarded by the Queen and her representatives with a grant of arms in recognition of his, and I quote, courageous, worthy, and famous enterprises into unhaunted parts of Africa and America. On the crest, dated 1566, we can see the striking image of a bound enslaved person who represents early examples of the enforced migration of millions of African people. Shakespeare was born into and growing up in a world where English people were interacting in a variety of ways with people from different cultures, not only through enslavement. Reports by early modern travellers who would sail to other countries through trade in a range of commodities reveals cross-cultural encounters through the merchants meeting with African kings, as we see here, to exchange goods. I was intrigued by cross-cultural encounters that may have taken place in England, though. We know they travelled to Africa, but what was happening in England? So John Hawkins' father, William Hawkins, travelled to Brazil in the 1530s, and he invited a Brazilian king to England to visit Henry VIII. The archival source states that in the course of these voyages, he exchanged goods and trafficked with Negroes and took of them elephants' teeth and other commodities. And this is a quote from Hakluyt. On the second voyage, one of the savage kings of the country of Brazil was contented to take the ship with him and to be transported hither to England. The Brazilian king, being arrived, was brought up to London and presented at Whitehall again, not far from here, to King Henry VIII. At the sight of whom the king and all the nobility did not a little marvel, and not without cause, for in his cheeks were holes made according to the savage manner, and therein small bones were planted, standing an inch from the said holes, which in his own country was reputed for great bravery. He had precious stones about the bigness of peas. All apparel, behaviour, and gesture were very strange to the beholders. In this cross-cultural encounter that took place here in London, what seemed strange to Henry VIII and people in England at the time were actually signs of great bravery in the Brazilian king's own country. In our modern world, when we encounter people who are different from ourselves, I encourage you to remember the lesson embedded within this 16th century encounter. What may be unusual to us may be culturally or personally significant to somebody else. Through this exchange, we can learn to respect, warmly welcome, and celebrate our different cultures, languages, religions, races, and traditions. The multiplicity of our classrooms, in our society, and thanks to this Lit in Colour programme, the diverse literature we can study enriches our experiences and understanding of the world. Okay, another checkpoint. So, William Hawkins was the father of John Hawkins. True or false? 1 for true, 2 for false. 1, it's true, well done. And John Hawkins was punished for his voyages. 1 for true, 2 for false. Excellent, it's false. Unfortunately, he was celebrated. Holes in the cheeks of the Brazilian king was a sign of great bravery in his country. True or false? Yeah, true. Thank you. So, thinking again about the different migrations that took place, not only did cross-cultural encounters take place on land and when travellers were going to different places, but also the crew of the ships that sailed. So the crew of the Mary Rose is now believed to be a multiracial crew. When the Mary Rose sank just off the coast of Southampton, Jacques Francis, an African diver, was living in Southampton and working for an Italian man called Peter Paolo Corsi. The king ordered a recovery operation to salvage the valuable weaponry that had sunk with the ship, and Corsi assembled a specialist diving team. So this next image is of African divers, just like Jacques Francis, who were specially trained to dive for pearls at the bottom of the ocean. In Shakespeare's Twelfth Night and The Tempest and many of his plays, we see shipwrecks because they were common occurrences in the 16th and 17th century. Travelling by sea was hazardous and were portrayed in Shakespeare's plays as having providential, dangerous outcomes or plot twists for his characters and the plots of his play. On board the Mary Rose, there were English crew members, an Italian project leader, and Jacques Francis, an African diver, living and working in England. So I'd like you to imagine that you are Jacques Francis and have been given the important task of diving for the expensive weaponry on behalf of Henry VIII. What would the dive have been like for Jacques Francis? What would it have been like for him, an African person living in Southampton in the 16th century? And in your discussion, try to use some of those key words. So turn and talk to the people around you. What would that dive have been like? And we do have some microphones around, so can you share some of your ideas with us, please? So what do you think that dive and that experience would have been like for Jacques Francis? Anyone willing to share?
I think he wouldn't have been appreciated as much.
Yeah, good point. Excellent. Thank you. Any other suggestions? I think there's one over there.
I was going to say is like, I'd think, well, why am I doing this? Because I'm just a commodity, these people. I mean, I'm about, like black people, they're slaves, and they're thinking I'm as worth as much as this pearl or as much as this gun. So why am I doing this when I'm no better than the things I'm getting? Because black persons at all, I mean, even if they're free and allowed home and board and money, they're still going to be in society where they thought it was a slave, thought it was nothing. If I had them, I'd just swim off. I'd think, why am I here? Well, I'm being taken back to England and be treated like rubbish and know that nothing I do matters.
Thank you so much. Any other suggestions? Yeah, there's one here.
I really didn't want to put my hand up again, but I was taking a more modern outlook on it, and I was thinking the traumatic experience of just going down and seeing so many dead bodies in a wreckage constantly and going back to Southampton in the 16th century. I'm pretty sure they weren't talking about those kind of topics back then, but I figured that would probably be a different perspective.
Yeah, but absolutely. They're still going to be human and have that human experience. That would be really scary and horrific. Thank you so much. Brilliant. Okay, so this is from Miranda Kaufman's book, and I worked with her on teaching black Tudors in schools. So I was the only English teacher as part of that project, but I found the context really fascinating and important for my English classroom as well. So this is Miranda's interpretation. So Jacques plunged into the sea and the cold engulfed him. It was so different to the warm waters where he'd learnt to swim and dive as a child. He took a series of deep breaths, allowing his lungs to inflate with air and take precious oxygen into his blood and dive beneath the waves. As he reached the depths, he began to make out the shape of the wreck through the murky water. He had heard the tale of how this proud warship had met her doom. The men of the town didn't agree on exactly what had caused her to sink, but they well recalled the spectacle of her quick, cruel disappearance beneath the waves. The screams of the drowning men were loud enough to reach the shore. Their skeletons would be waiting for him among the sunken timbers. Hundreds of onlookers, including King Henry himself, had watched helpless as the ship went down. The Mary Rose, that's what they called her. And now that splendid ship lay lifeless before him in the water. Her side was studded with the guns of iron and bronze, the latter marked with a royal crest. That was why he was here, why the king had hired his master to salvage the expensive weaponry. The Venetian could not dive this deep himself, and so he found Jacques and the other divers in his team and brought them to this cold island to perform a miracle for the English king. Imtiaz Habib's research in his book, Black Lives in the English Archives, reveals more about the lives of the people who migrated to England and lived and worked here during Shakespeare's lifetime. Habib shares a royal response to multicultural England. In 1596 and 1601, Queen Elizabeth issued decrees expelling black people from England in order to regulate the overnumerous population. The Queen wrote, "There are of late divers blackamoors brought into this realm, of which kind of people there are already too many." The decree went on to say, Her Majesty's pleasure that those kind of people should be sent forth of the lands. In the wake of the Windrush scandal and the government's hostile environment policy, there are shocking continuities and resonances with the desire to expel immigrants. I share these stories and a range of archival research to give you an understanding of the world that Shakespeare was born into. During Shakespeare's lifetime, we get a sense of the ways in which the migration of people impacted the literary, cultural, social, economic, and political landscape he was living and writing in. John Stowe was a historian who wrote a comprehensive record of Shakespeare's London. This extract confirms the range of merchandise and commodities brought into London and the range of people who sailed between London and the wider world. Stowe writes, all kind of merchandise be easily conveyed to London, the principal storehouse and staple of all commodities within this realm, so that omitting to speak of great ships and other vessels of burden, there pertaineth to the cities of London, Westminster, and the borough of Southwark above the number, as is supposed, 2,000 wherries and other small boats. In Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, for instance, Antonio, the merchant, lost his ships and his goods at sea. They never made it to their destination. He lost a great deal of money, and it almost cost him a pound of flesh. We can begin to see how the evidence of Shakespeare's society depicted in Stowe's description, with the influx in ships and merchants trading, was absorbed into Shakespeare's plays and the characters he created. I'd like to continue by sharing with you some key contextual details that link directly to specific titles and extracts from Shakespeare's play. In 1597, when Shakespeare was around 13 years old, maybe around your age, Mary Phyllis was born in Africa. When she was about 6 or 7, she travelled from Africa to England and became a servant in a household just 20 minutes from where we are today. Her surname might be linked to her father's profession of basket weaving. By 1597, Phyllis had changed employment, which again suggests that she had, that even though she was a servant, she may have had the opportunity to make her own decisions and work for other people. Working for another family, she was baptised on the 3rd of June, 1597. Phyllis was one of many Africans baptised in Tudor England and living and working in Tudor England. Although Mary Phyllis was born hundreds of years before me, learning about her life resonated with my own observations and experiences. My mother was born in Jamaica and migrated to England, so she was both Jamaican and British. As a mixed-race woman, I often think of the term doubleness. I've wrestled with and finally come to appreciate and enjoy my existence of both and simultaneously. Shakespeare, I think, explores this further in his play Othello. Can you put your hands up? Have any of you read, seen, watched, studying Othello? Okay. So the eponymous character, Othello, is a black man living in Europe, and Emma Smith writes, reading Othello involves the immediate engagement with a paradox, so a contradictory statement. The prominent subtitle, The Moor of Venice, with the preposition of, particularly activates Othello's central paradox. The preposition of has two ambiguous meanings in the early modern period. So one is a sense of from, away from, out of, and suggests this idea of expulsion in our modern word off. And the other meaning can suggest of to indicate where someone originates from, their race or local origin. The historical meanings of register the sense in which Othello both belongs to and is rejected by Venice simultaneously as he serves and also threatens. He is both of and off Venice. Othello's peculiar status as insider and outsider to Venice, of in both of its early modern meanings, means that he and his mixed-race marriage embody the system of oppositions on which the play is structured. Another key word in the subtitle of Shakespeare's play is the word more, which alerts us to the possibility, contestability, and instability of the terms relating to race. Amberine Dadaboy has recently observed that contained within the word more is a geographic distinction, religious differentiation, and colour consciousness. The widespread use of more to refer to both religious and physical differences means that the word proves incredibly elastic, stretching to encompass a wide range of peoples and cultures. While the Argo circulates the most explicit and negative visions of Moors as lascivious, duplicitous, vengeful, superstitious, and jealous, the audience might have also encountered and be aware of noble Moors who were learned, trustworthy, devout, or worked for them or with them. As we can see through the range of people and reasons for migration to and from England, the way in which Shakespeare uses the term Moor appears to encompass the doubleness of people like Mary Phyllis, who were both of Africa and England, and the way in which she integrated into Elizabethan England through her baptism. The phrase Moor of Venice might actually speak to the possibility that Othello also has an integrated dual rather than divided identity. So this is another place where I feel that frustration and tension. So how might it feel for the characters, the real or historical people, or even people in modern-day London to have that dual identity? What might that mean for them in the past, but also for us now? Can you turn and talk, please? So what might that dual identity feel like, that doubleness? Okay, I will move on. I won't put you on the spot. But just drilling deeper into the language of just two words in the title, we can start to build connections between the plays and the contexts in which they were written. Some of the contextual details that I've shared reach further back beyond Shakespeare's birth, not only to give you an understanding of the world that he was born into, but also that's exactly what Shakespeare did. So he was drawing upon earlier works, and this tale from 1565, when just after he was born, he took this from Cinthio's play about a mixed-race marriage. But I'm also going to take us way back to the 14th century as well, so even 200 years before Shakespeare, so that we can get a sense of the type of travel narratives and accounts of the East that persisted for centuries. Despite the extremely unreliable and often fantastical nature of the travels it describes, John Mandeville's travel memoir, it was used as a work of reference for Christopher Columbus, for example, was heavily influenced by both Marco Polo's, by this and Marco Polo's 13th century travels. Mandeville claims to have travelled to countries populated by dog-headed men, cannibals, Amazons, and pygmies. So I just want to have a look at this extract from Shakespeare to think about how that's working its way into Shakespeare's writing. So this is the scene where Othello explains his migration story, which led to Desdemona falling in love with him, and just thinking of some of the questions that we might explore in our classrooms to explore the character of Othello and the theme of migration in this extract. So here, Othello says, the battles, sieges, fortunes that I have passed, disastrous chances of moving accidents by flood and fields, of hairbreadth scapes, in the imminent deadly breach, of being taken by the insolent foe and sold to slavery, of my redemption thence, and with it all my travels history, wherein of antres vast and deserts idle, rough quarries, rocks and hills, whose heads touch heaven. It was my hint to speak, such was the process, and of cannibals that each other eat the anthropophagy, and the men whose heads do grow beneath their shoulders. This to hear would Desdemona seriously incline. So here we can see how the history, his own history, and travellers' tales work their way into his texts, and how he has included cannibals and some of those fantastical tales that he may have read of in his own history. Looking at another play, The Merchant of Venice, I want to put side by side some of that tension between what was happening in Shakespeare's world and how it's working its way into his plays, and how Shakespeare, he upholds some of the kind of offence, but then also the ways in which that his characters can speak up against those offences as well. So on the right-hand side, this was a poem in 1593, was fixed upon a church wall in London. And in it, it reveals the anti-stranger, anti-alien and anti-Jewish discourses in Elizabethan England. And it reads, "Ye strangers that do inhabit this land, note the same writing, do it understand. Chance it well for safeguarding your lives. Conceit it well for safeguarding your lives, your goods, your children, and your dearest wives. Your Machiavellian merchant spoils the state. Your usury doth leave us all for dead. Your artifacts and craftsman works are fate, and like the Jews you eat us up as bread. The merchants doth engross all kinds of wares, forestalls the markets, wheresoever he goes, sends forth his wares by peddlers to the fairs, retails at home, and with his horrible shows undoeth thousands." So we see this anti-alien sentiment that was also in Queen Elizabeth's decree, where she wanted to expel people. In The Merchant of Venice, we have the character Shylock, who kind of speaks up, and there's this really powerful scene where he's defending the humanity of himself and people like him, and Geoffrey was talking about people who are on the margins. And Shylock declares, "I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge?" So he's speaking up against this anti-Jewish sentiment that he faces in the play. And another instance of this is where in Titus Andronicus, where Shakespeare's Aaron has a defence of blackness. And this image is another kind of audience drawing from 1595, and we see Aaron as the black character. He has had an affair, and he has a mixed-race child that is born, and the only mixed-race child in Shakespeare's work. So I was immediately interested by the possibility of this happening on stage, and a mixed-race child being born. And Aaron declares, "Well, God give her rest. What hath he sent her?" And the nurse describes this mixed-race child as a devil. But Aaron, in defence of his child and in defence of his blackness, says, "A joyful issue." But the nurse retaliates with, "A joyless, dismal, black and sorrowful issue. Here is the babe as loathsome as a toad amongst the fair-faced breeders of our clime." But Aaron asks, "Is black so base a hue? Coal black is better than another hue. in that it scorns to bear another hue, for all the water in the ocean can never turn the swan's legs black legs to white, although she lave them hourly in the flood. So we get that sense of washing the Ethiop white that we saw in those old adages from classical antiquity. But here we have that tension of Aaron speaking up in defence of blackness. So to kind of come to a close, I'm going to ask you to discuss 3 things, and I will share 3 things to finish. So I'd like you to discuss 3 things that you've either found out in this session, that you can link to some of the plays that you've looked at, and 3 things that you may have, learned from here. So turn and talk, please. You won't have to share it, but what 3 things have you learned? Thank you. So hopefully the 3 things you can take back to your school and discuss further in your essays, in your classroom discussions. The reason I'm interested in this and fascinated by it is because I think that if we have the courage to confront the context of Shakespeare's plays and the legacies that we often continue to live with, I think that it can enrich our studies. I think if we have the courage in our choice of plays and also the choice of questions that we ask of the plays as well, that can also enrich our studies and our understanding, and making those connections between the context and also the actual text themselves and what may have influenced Shakespeare's plays can continue to keep the plays relevant as we study them. Also, in my book, I kind of offer an antidote, that it's my hope that through our courage to confront and challenge the tensions in the plays, it will lead us to have greater empathy with each other and for one another, so that we don't continue to recreate those images, those ideals, those outdated ideals of beauty, and that our blackness, our greatness, and our individuality can actually be celebrated as part of our study and challenge of these plays. Thank you so much for listening.